Have you ever caught yourself pondering the real essence behind the world's greatest spiritual guides? I mean, think about it. What if the key to understanding enlightenment is hidden in the way these figures from completely different cultures and times are somehow interconnected? I remember when I first started digging into this, it felt like a wild rabbit hole. But stick with me here. This might sound a bit out there, but I promise there's something worth considering. Buddha once said, "The way is not in the sky, the way is in the heart." That line hit me harder the more I thought about it. What's fascinating is that Jesus echoes a similar idea. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. These aren't just poetic quotes. Both are pointing to something deep, that the journey to spiritual understanding isn't about searching outside ourselves, but looking inward, into our hearts and minds. I used to think the path to wisdom was some external quest, like a treasure map you had to follow. But now, after really sitting with it, it's clear that the treasure's buried right within us. So, why am I bringing up both Buddha and Jesus in the same breath? At first glance, it feels like comparing apples and oranges, right? Different eras, different continents, different traditions. But the more you dig into their teachings, the more you start to notice some pretty striking similarities. It's like peeling back the layers on an onion, each layer revealing something deeper and more interconnected than you might expect. Okay, so here's where I went off the deep end a bit. And trust me, I get how this might sound, but what if Jesus was, in some sense, a Bodhisattva? That word might be new if you're not familiar with Buddhist teachings, but think of it as someone who's on the verge of reaching enlightenment, but instead of crossing that final threshold, they hang back to help others along the path. Yeah, it sounds wild, but hear me out. The idea popped into my head one day when I was reading about their lives. There's something about the parallels that started to stand out to me. Think about their births. Both Jesus and Buddha's arrivals were shrouded in mystery and divine intervention. The stories go beyond the physical. They tap into something symbolic, hinting that these weren't just ordinary lives. And then, their teachings. Buddha speaks about the cessation of suffering and finding liberation through understanding the nature of existence. Jesus, too, talks about salvation, but instead of focusing on the mind alone, his message centers around love, compassion, and grace. At their core, they're both guiding people towards some ultimate truth, some greater state of being. It's not just the stories about their lives that got me thinking, it's the message of transformation. Buddha reached enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and Jesus, after his crucifixion, was resurrected. Two moments that symbolize profound change, the overcoming of worldly limitations. Both, in their way, transcended death, one through the mind, the other through spirit. I know, it can sound far-fetched to start drawing connections between them, especially since they come from such different worlds. But if we really think about it, isn't the core of their teachings aimed at the same thing? Enlightenment, salvation, freedom from suffering, they're just different words for a shared idea. And that's where things start to get interesting. The stories, the teachings, they might seem different on the surface, but maybe they're just different paths leading to the same peak. Whether you resonate more with Buddha's meditative path or Jesus' call for compassion, the destination seems remarkably similar, a state of inner peace and connection that goes beyond the self. This kind of thinking wasn't something I just jumped into. I had to sit with it for a while. There's a part of me that resisted the idea at first, maybe because it felt like I was crossing a line, mixing traditions that weren't meant to be mixed. But then again, isn't spirituality at its best a quest to find the deeper truths that connect us all? What I'm realizing more and more is that the lines we draw between spiritual traditions might be more of a reflection of our own need to categorize and separate things than they are about the actual truths those traditions are pointing us toward. Maybe, just maybe, these spiritual giants are all just messengers trying to guide us toward the same thing, toward something that, deep down, we already know but just need to be reminded of. A Bodhisattva, we start to see some intriguing parallels. Think about it. Jesus' entire mission was centered on compassion, self-sacrifice, and guiding humanity towards salvation. He devoted his life to healing the sick, teaching about love, forgiveness, and ultimately giving himself up for the greater good of all. In many ways, this mirrors the Bodhisattva's path of selflessness, where the focus isn't on personal salvation, but on helping others achieve spiritual freedom. Jesus didn't seek personal glory or material gain. He dedicated his life to serving others, even when it led to suffering and death. This echoes the Bodhisattva's willingness to delay their own liberation until all beings are free from suffering. When you think about Jesus' crucifixion, his act of ultimate sacrifice, it's not hard to draw a line to the Bodhisattva's choice to bear the burden of others' suffering out of compassion. But it's not just about the parallels in their lives. It's also about their teachings. The Sermon on the Mount, for instance, where Jesus emphasizes the importance of humility, mercy, and peace, feels remarkably aligned with the Bodhisattva ideal. Both Jesus and the Buddha stress the importance of inner transformation. Jesus through the heart and Buddha through the mind. Both understood that true peace and liberation come from within, not through external circumstances. Of course, these comparisons aren't meant to equate the two entirely. Jesus and Buddha came from different cultural and religious contexts, and their paths reflect the unique challenges and perspectives of their times. But what's undeniable is that both offered a radical rethinking of the human experience, how to live, how to love, and how to transcend suffering. As I continued to explore these connections, I couldn't help but wonder, what if these teachings are part of a greater universal truth, one that transcends specific religious traditions? What if, at their core, the messages of Jesus and Buddha are guiding us toward the same destination, a state of profound compassion, inner peace, and unity with all beings? When I first started looking into this, I was skeptical. After all, Christianity and Buddhism seem worlds apart. But the more I studied, the more I began to see that these two traditions aren't necessarily in opposition. In fact, they might just be different expressions of the same timeless wisdom, speaking to the deep longing we all have for meaning, connection, and freedom from suffering. What really stands out to me is how both Jesus and Buddha challenge us to shift our perspective, from focusing on ourselves to focusing on others, from seeking external validation to finding inner peace. It's not about rigid adherence to dogma, it's about transformation from the inside out. Whether through Jesus' call to love your neighbor or Buddha's teachings on compassion and mindfulness, the message is clear. Our path to liberation is intertwined with the well-being of others. This idea of interconnectedness is something I think we can all relate to, regardless of our spiritual background. We all want to feel connected, to ourselves, to others, to something greater. And perhaps that's why the teachings of Jesus and Buddha resonate so deeply even today. They remind us that we're not alone on this journey, that our lives have purpose, and that we have the power to cultivate love, compassion, and wisdom in the world. As we continue to explore these parallels, I encourage you to think about how these teachings might apply to your own life. Whether you identify with one tradition, both, or neither, there's something universally human in the messages they share. At the end of the day, Jesus and Buddha were both trying to answer the same fundamental questions we all grapple with. How can we live a good life? How can we find peace in a world full of suffering? And how can we help others along the way? The answers they offer might come in different forms, but the heart of their teachings is the same: love, compassion, and a deep commitment to the well-being of all beings. And that, my friends, is something worth pondering, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey. To enter the kingdom of God, a metaphorical rebirth that symbolized the inner transformation necessary for spiritual salvation. Buddha, in turn, emphasized the process of awakening through mindfulness and insight into the nature of reality. For both teachers, the path to liberation wasn't about external rituals or adherence to rules. It was about a profound internal shift, a radical transformation of the heart and mind. This focus on inner change over outward appearances is where their teachings align so strongly. Jesus didn't just call for surface-level righteousness. He often criticized the Pharisees, the religious leaders of his time, for being more concerned with appearances than with genuine spiritual integrity. "Clean the inside of the cup," he said, "and the outside will also be clean." Likewise, Buddha taught that suffering comes from our attachments and illusions, and that real peace can only be found when we confront the nature of our own minds. What fascinates me is how both emphasize that the path to true peace and salvation is an inward journey. Jesus' parables often pointed to the idea that the kingdom of God is within you, while Buddha's teachings stressed that nirvana is achieved through insight and personal effort. Both believe that the spiritual journey requires dedication, reflection, and a deep understanding of oneself, and that this process leads to an experience of profound freedom. But here's where things get even more interesting. Both Jesus and Buddha offered a message of hope, not just for a select few, but for all people. Jesus' message of salvation wasn't restricted to the elite or the righteous. It was for everyone, especially the marginalized, the poor, and the outcast. Buddha, too, opened the path of enlightenment to anyone willing to walk it, regardless of caste, wealth, or status. Both men saw the potential for spiritual transformation in every individual, no matter their circumstances. Now, it's easy to look at these parallels and start wondering about historical connections, whether these ideas traveled across cultures or whether one tradition influenced the other. And while we may never have definitive answers to those questions, what we do have are two powerful spiritual messages that resonate deeply with the human experience. Both Jesus and Buddha recognized that suffering is an inherent part of life, and both offered a path to transcend that suffering through love, compassion, and wisdom. In Buddhism, this idea is encapsulated in the Four Noble Truths: that life is marked by suffering, dukkha, that suffering arises from attachment, that it can be overcome, and that there is a path to its cessation. Jesus, too, recognized the brokenness of the world, but offered a message of healing and redemption through faith, love, and forgiveness. Both paths offer hope, not by escaping the reality of suffering, but by transforming our relationship to it. Another key parallel is the emphasis on humility. Both spiritual leaders lived lives of simplicity and rejected worldly power. Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, a powerful symbol of service and humility, while Buddha left behind his princely life to become a wandering ascetic. They both demonstrated through their lives that true spiritual leadership comes not from domination, but from service to others. It's this spirit of humility and selflessness that ties back into the Bodhisattva ideal we discussed earlier. The Bodhisattva, like Jesus, dedicates their life to the liberation of others, even at the cost of their own comfort or progress. Jesus' ultimate act of self-sacrifice on the cross can be seen in the same light: a willingness to endure suffering for the benefit of humanity, to offer himself out of love and compassion for the greater good. As we dive deeper into these parallels, it's clear that the teachings of both Jesus and Buddha transcend their specific cultural and historical contexts. They touch on universal truths about the human condition, our struggles with suffering, our search for meaning, and our desire for inner peace. And while their paths may differ in some ways, the underlying wisdom they offer is remarkably aligned. For me, the most profound takeaway from these parallels is the reminder that the path to spiritual awakening, whether through the teachings of Jesus, Buddha, or another tradition, is about cultivating love, compassion, and understanding. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and striving to alleviate suffering in ourselves and others. Both teachers remind us that, at its core, spirituality isn't about dogma or division. It's about connection, transformation, and the relentless pursuit of a more compassionate world. As we continue to explore these ideas, I invite you to think about how the teachings of Jesus and Buddha might inspire your own journey. Whether you come from a religious background or not, there's something deeply human in their messages. They challenge us to look beyond ourselves, to cultivate a sense of compassion that extends to all beings, and to seek a deeper, more meaningful understanding of life. In the end, the beauty of these teachings lies not in their differences, but in their shared vision of a world transformed by love, compassion, and wisdom. A vision that, I believe, has the power to unite us all. As we reflect on the teachings of Jesus and Buddha, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Both figures, despite originating from vastly different times, cultures, and religious backgrounds, illuminate universal truths that resonate with the human experience. Their emphasis on inner transformation, compassion, and the power of love stands as a testament to their enduring wisdom. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God being within, he invited us to recognize the divine potential within ourselves, a call echoed by Buddha's teachings on enlightenment. Both spiritual leaders urged their followers to look beyond external appearances and social norms, encouraging a shift towards personal and spiritual awakening. They believe that true spiritual growth doesn't happen in isolation, but is deeply intertwined with how we treat others, especially those on the margins of society. What truly resonates with me is how both Jesus and Buddha embodied their teachings through action. Their lives weren't just about preaching lofty ideals, but living out compassion and selflessness. Jesus' parables and Buddha's allegories weren't just stories, they were tools to provoke deep reflection and guide others toward understanding complex spiritual truths in a simple, accessible way. They used familiar experiences to unravel profound concepts like love, forgiveness, and the nature of suffering. Yet, despite these similarities, it's essential to recognize the differences in their teachings. Jesus' path, rooted in faith and divine grace, contrasts with the Buddhist emphasis on personal effort and mindfulness. Where Jesus is seen as the divine Son of God, Buddha is viewed as an enlightened teacher, showing us that while both paths lead to spiritual awakening, they require different approaches. This divergence in worldview enriches our understanding of spiritual growth, reminding us that the journey toward enlightenment can take many forms.